As Mark said, the report that we are releasing today examines specifically the incidence of overcrowding among immigrant and native-born workers, overcrowding, that is, in terms of residential housing. As Mark also said, the report was written by myself and Karen Ziegler, who is also here at the Center for Immigration Studies. Now, overcrowding is an important issue for a number of reasons, but the most relevant question right now is as it relates to the current pandemic. There actually is a very large body of research, a lot of it done in the United States, looking at the relationship between overcrowded housing and the spread of respiratory communicable diseases like COVID. And that research, not surprisingly, finds a very strong link between the two. Now, the standard definition in the United States of overcrowded housing is that there's more than one person per room in your housing unit, excluding things like hallways, porches, balconies, bathrooms. There's very specific data gathered in that way. So there's a pretty well-established way of looking at overcrowded housing, but one could think of a different definition. Now, in addition to all the prior research looking at things like TB or the seasonal flu and overcrowded housing, there's some new research looking at specifically COVID-19 that also finds a link between crowding and the spread of the disease. Let me quote from one. One of these newer studies came from the Donahue Institute at the University of Massachusetts. And that study concluded that, that overcrowding housing was the most indicative measure of COVID-19 spread, that's their words, that they found looking across communities. I also should point out there's a new blog posting on our website that looks at the correlation between overcrowded housing and the incidence of COVID-19 infection across the nation's counties. And again, we find a pretty reasonably strong relationship consistent with prior analysis between the spread of COVID-19 and the incidence or the concentration of overcrowded housing. Now, of course, none of this should be surprising. Living in close proximity to others obviously makes it more likely that communicable disease will spread. And if someone becomes sick, if the household is crowded, it makes it harder to isolate someone. So again, it's not just the research, but kind of common sense would suggest that crowding is likely to facilitate the spread of respiratory infections. Now, our analysis is based on the 2018 American Community Survey collected by the U.S. Census Bureau. And again, we use that standard definition of overcrowding. We look specifically at immigrant and native-born workers. In the survey, immigrants, or the foreign-born, as the Census Bureau was referred to them, are all people who are not U.S. citizens at birth. And it includes people on green cards, it includes naturalized citizens, and it includes some number of illegal immigrants, and we'll discuss that. In general, the survey is assumed to capture most illegal immigrants. What is certain is that a large number are in the survey, and later on in our analysis, we do try to break them out separately. But for the most part, we look just at immigrants overall. Now, when looking at immigrant workers, we find that immigrant workers are about 4 times more likely overall to live in overcrowded housing. It's about 3.5% for the native-born, but 14.3% for immigrants. As a result, immigrants account for nearly half of all workers in America living in overcrowded housing. I know that number seems hard to believe, but it is almost half, 46%. Even though immigrants themselves are only 17% of all workers, they just make up an enormous share of all overcrowded workers. Now, to be sure, many factors having nothing to do with overcrowding or immigration have contributed in the United States to the spread of COVID-19. Nevertheless, as we'll show, the evidence indicates that overcrowding, as I've already said, actually, the overcrowding facilitates the spread of COVID-19, and immigration has added enormously to overcrowding. There are consequences, of course, and We see this often when it comes to overcrowding when we look at specific sectors of the economy. There have been a number of shutdowns at warehouses and order processing facilities, including those run by Amazon and Walmart, because workers in these facilities have gotten sick. In just May and June, the CDC reported that 111 meat and poultry processing facilities had significant outbreaks of COVID-19, and 24 of them had to be shut down, at least temporarily. Now, a significant share of workers employed in low-wage jobs, many of which are considered essential during the COVID epidemic, live in overcrowded housing, and immigrants account in many cases for a majority of workers living in overcrowded housing. They don't necessarily account for a majority of workers in this sector, but they do account for a majority in many cases of workers living in overcrowded housing. For example, take the job category of butcher and meat processor. So a lot of these people work in these facilities that slaughter and cut up meat. Is one of the areas where overcrowding is quite common. In 2018, 24% of immigrant butchers and meat processors lived in overcrowded housing. Now, the comparable figure for native-born workers doing that same work was 6%. Now, because immigrants who do this kind of work are so much more likely to live in crowded housing, they account for 1/3 of all the butchers and meat processors overall, but they account for about 2/3 of all those who live in overcrowded housing. So that would be a good example of a sector where immigration and immigrant workers make up an enormous fraction of the overcrowded problem. Let's look at one other, and I won't bore with too many statistics. The report is replete with those. But if we look at packers and packagers, these are a lot of these people do things like work in warehouses. We find that 24% of immigrants in that occupation live in overcrowded housing compared to 8% of native-born workers who do that same work. As a result, immigrants are 41% of packers and packagers, so they're a big percent, but they're 68% of packagers and packagers who live in crowded housing. So again, a disproportional percent of people employed in that occupation who live in crowded housing are immigrants, because the immigrants are so much more likely to be in overcrowded housing to begin with. Now, the bottom line is that immigration, of course, has added enormously to overcrowded housing in a number of sectors, including production, healthcare support, transportation, moving, food preparation, sales, and farming. And again, many of these occupations are both low wage and thought to be essential during the COVID-19 epidemic. Now, the high rate among immigrant workers overall or in specific occupations must not be thought of as some kind of moral failing on their part. Rather, it partly reflects the fact that immigrants, especially overall, are employed in these low-wage jobs, and they're also more likely to live in urban areas where cost of living is higher and overcrowding is more common. And another contributing factor is immigrants tend to live in larger families. We have a lot of statistics on that in the report, but on average, immigrant families are larger than native-born families, and so are their households, and also a larger fraction of in large households. But interestingly, and I think this is one of our most important findings, even when immigrants earn the same wage as the native-born, live in the same size household, and reside in an area with the same population density as the native-born, they are still much more likely to live in overcrowded housing than comparable natives. That is, natives who live in those same circumstances, earn the same wage, and so forth. Just to give you one example, I won't bore you, there's a lot. 35% of immigrant workers who live in an urban area, have 5 members in their household, and earn $10 an hour or less, live in overcrowded housing. So that's 35%. Of natives who live in the same conditions, 16% live in overcrowded housing. And the same pattern holds even as we move up the income distribution. Higher income immigrants are still much more likely to live in overcrowded housing than high income or higher income native-born workers, even when you control for household size and whether the person lives in an urban area. So why is this? Well, I don't know that we have a clear answer, but I think it's very likely that cultural preferences play a significant role in explaining why both legal and illegal immigrants are more likely to live in crowded housing than native-born workers, even those that are comparable. A large share of immigrants come from developing countries where houses are typically much smaller than in the United States. So it should not be too surprising if many of them choose or have a different perspective about personal space, with many choosing to live in more moderately sized homes, even when they might be able to afford something larger. It makes sense. Also, immigrants' desire to save money on housing and perhaps send money home may also help explain why immigrants, even higher income immigrants, are much more likely to live in overcrowding housing than higher income natives with the same household size and so forth. In case you're wondering, the estimate for sending money home is about $68 billion. So that's a lot of money. And prior research indicates it's mostly sent home by immigrants. And so that could represent a significant share of their income. So living in more modest homes might be a way of saving and doing that. So that might be another reason. Now, something else. Since the data we used included illegal and legal immigrants, it could be that it is just the illegal immigrants that live in overcrowded housing. And they have the high rates of it, and that's really what explains that overall picture for the native-born. But when we try to separate out legal and illegal immigrants, we don't really find that that's the case. Based on the Census Bureau data that we used, we estimated that illegal immigrants, consistent with other work, they are about 4% of all workers in America, and they make up 16% of all workers in overcrowded housing. So yes, their rates are high and they are disproportionately in overcrowded housing, that's for sure. But we also estimated that legal immigrant workers, who are much more numerous, are 13% of all workers, but 30% of workers in overcrowded housing. In other words, legal immigrants by themselves are approaching 1/3 of all the overcrowded housing, our workers living in overcrowded housing, even though they're only about 13% of all workers. So even if there was no illegal immigration to the United States, legal immigration by itself would still have added significantly to the overcrowding problem. Now, it should also be added that while overcrowding is more common among people who are new arrivals, that was another thing that we examined. We were trying to figure out if maybe it's really just something that people go through as a temporary phase. But it does not appear that the problem is simply among newcomers. Of immigrant workers who have lived in the United States for 10 or more years, 13.4% lived in overcrowded housing in 2018, based on the census data. This compares to 14.3% for all immigrant workers. So yes, overcrowding declines over time, presumably as immigrants become more prosperous and earn higher wages, but then other things might tend to cancel that out. More relatives might join them over time. They may have additions to their family through having children. And so the difference between new established immigrants, people here for more than 10 years, and immigrants overall in overcrowding rates actually turns out to not be that different. In short, overcrowding is not just an issue for the newly arrived. Now, all of that having been said, it is still the case that overcrowding among both immigrants and natives declines significantly with higher wages, and that is especially true of immigrants. Though, again, they're more likely to be overcrowded at every wage level, and even when you throw in family size and where they live, it's still the case that they're more likely to be overcrowded. It's still the case higher wages is associated with lower rates of overcrowding. Therefore, paying higher wages to workers would almost certainly help reduce overcrowding, especially those at the bottom end of the labor market where overcrowding tends to be more common. More than half of all workers who live in overcrowded conditions earn less than $15 an hour. or $15 an hour and less, I should say. So it is something that is much more prevalent among people at the bottom. So if you want to increase wages to hopefully alleviate some of the overcrowding, reducing the flow of immigrants in the country would not only directly reduce overcrowding over time by avoiding adding to it, it would also help reduce crowding indirectly by putting upward pressure on wages. Now, of course, employers across multiple sectors have argued for decades that there are not enough workers, particularly in low-wage jobs. However, I would just add this. It's a bit of a digression, but I'll say this. If workers really were in such a short supply, then we would expect to find that wages would be rising very rapidly. But in general, and certainly not at the bottom end of the labor market, that has not been happening for most workers. There's a large body of research on that. I would also add, if anyone's interested, that the majority of workers in just about every low-wage, lower-status job, from meat packer to janitor to construction labor to home health care aide, was born in the United States. So the notion that with higher wages we wouldn't be able to attract any Americans to these jobs doesn't make sense. After all, the majority, in many cases an overwhelming majority of the people who do this kind of work, were born in the United States. Now, to be sure, keeping wages low can create benefits for both employers and consumers. But keeping wages down by adding large numbers of immigrant workers almost certainly affects the livelihood of the least educated and poorest Americans, both immigrant and native born, and it also creates other issues. And most important for the current discussion, it adds enormously to overcrowded housing. Now, in conclusion, I will say this. Once more data becomes available and the disease has run its course, researchers will be better able to determine the complex relationships between all the variables that contributed to the spread of COVID-19. However, it seems certain that overcrowding is one of the factors facilitating the spread of the disease, just as it does other similar affections. Of course, it would be wrong to think that overcrowding and the immigration that contributes to it are the only reason that the United States has done worse than many other industrialized countries in dealing with COVID. That is clearly not the case. That said, it seems almost certain that overcrowding has played a significant role in spreading the disease, and it is very unlikely that we continue to allow in large numbers of immigrants and not add significantly to the overcrowded problem. But I would add that if we want to raise wages, reducing immigration is not the only thing we need to be thinking about. For example, raising the minimum wage, perhaps strengthening unions, or perhaps increasing income transfers, like the Earned Income Tax Credit for workers, and the additional child tax credit, the refundable portion. It's a cash payment to low-wage people, typically workers, and so is the Earned Income Tax Credit. These things as well might make housing more affordable for low-wage workers. But immigration does seem to be playing a very large role in adding directly to the problem of overcrowding and in likely keeping down wages at the bottom end. So at the very least, policymakers need to consider the impact of immigration if we want to reduce our vulnerability to future pandemics.